agenda is what we have been all waiting for, the keynote address of WID Sri Lanka conference. So today we have with us Dr. Prabhani Kuruppumullage Don. Dr. Prabhani serves as an assistant research professor at the Department of Statistics, the Pennsylvania State University. At Penn State, she oversees all functionalities of statistics online classes, collaborates on multiple research projects, mentors undergraduate and graduate research students, serves as an academic advisor to statistics, data science undergraduate and graduate students, and serves as a biostatistical consultant for Penn State's Clinical and Translation Institute. After receiving her PhD from Penn State, Dr. Prabhani completed her postdoctoral training at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. So before joining Penn State faculty, Dr. Prabhani served as an assistant professor at the University of Rhode Island. So with great pleasure, I would now invite Dr. Prabhani Kuruppumullage to deliver the keynote address on finding your place in the data science continuum, a statistician's thought. Over to you.
All right. First of all, can you see my slides and can you hear me?
Yes, your slides are visible and we can hear you.
All right, perfect. Well, hello everyone, and thank you for the invitation as well as the nice introduction. And I also want to commend the organizing committee for the wonderful program that you have put together. And I'm not sure whether there's any wisdom that I can share with you that the yesterday's speakers haven't done already, but I'm hoping that at least I can add a little different flavor. So before I start, I'm going to apologize a little advance if I feel disoriented because it's a little past midnight right now, and I just got back attending one of my friends, so I'm not in the academic mood right now. But anyway, when I received the invitation first, I wasn't sure what sort of a talk that would fit well. So since the audience seems pretty diverse, I figured I would keep my talk very general without getting into too much technical details. But I also wanted to use this opportunity to convey a message and perhaps boost the confidence a little bit. So yesterday, you heard from some amazing speakers that are in different career paths. And today you will hear from a few more. And while listening to any one of them, if you thought to yourself that it's something that I would like to do, I really want to emphasize that you have the right background and ample resources at your hand. And none of these is like, everything is attainable, right? So I just wanted to convey that message. And all right. So as I said earlier, I kept the title of my talk very vague, and I do not plan to go into technical details, too much technical details, but I figured I will start by giving some idea about the notion of data science, and at least my point of view, and perhaps talk about a few projects that I have worked with that falls under the umbrella. So it's not news that nowadays institutes, organizations rely on data to make strategic business decisions to improve their growth, right? And this is certainly not a recent strategy, although it might feel like it because of some of the terminology like big data, data science, that got trendier in last decade or so. So for example, in 2016, Michael Vedder presented this nice summary of how history of data and analytical tools have evolved over time, which I think is a nice reminder that the notion of collecting and analyzing data to make decisions is not new. So what is new, if any? What is data science continuum? What are different roles and why do we care? These might be some of the questions that comes to your mind, right? So let's start by thinking what data science is. And if we look back, sometime back, many in the community viewed statistics as a branch of mathematics, and they struggled to explain the differences. Of course, there are a lot of train of thoughts, and out of these ideas, one that I actually resonate with is the idea that was presented by Joe Harding, which says statistics is using data and knowledge about randomness to condense and communicate contextualized information. So this idea, I think, associates with more probabilistic approach, and I like that. So with time, when the term data science got trendier, around between 2010 2015, I think many in the community then struggled to separate what statistics and data science are. So one position is that data science and statistics have very limited overlapping. When data science initiatives first started to develop some time back, many of these initiatives did not include statisticians, because at the time the perception was statistics is more about small data and traditional tools for their analysis, while data science is focused more on big data, big questions, and new techniques. So this notion, I think, came from a computer scientist or machine learning community. Then there was another position in the community that simply said, whenever someone does something with data, we should claim them as statisticians. So those, I think, are the two extremes. And with time, I think the community settled on more balanced, democratic notion about what data science is. And I think everyone, most of them now agree that it's not just a rebranding of statistics or machine learning, it's a field itself. And with that, a lot of universities started offering data science programs. And nowadays, these data science initiatives are more joint efforts across departments like statistics, computer science, IT, business, engineering, and many others. So with that, I think a valid question to ask is that if we have the background and training from any one of those traditional fields that we mentioned, do we not have a place in the job market anymore? So if we do a quick search on some common job titles, you come across titles like data analyst, data scientist, data architect, business analyst, data engineer. And if you compare all these different roles very carefully and analyze the skills required, you will see that there is a lot of overlap, especially at the entry level. And any one of you who have the traditional training can adopt. But I also think this makes the competition a little stronger. So irrespective of what your degree title says, you are equally qualified to take any of these roles. Having said that, coming from the academic side, I think that what that means is that irrespective of the program, it's important to introduce some of these tools within the existing curricula, but I don't think that we have to scratch off what we have right now and then reintroduce completely novel curricula. I do think there is a value to the traditional training that we have been receiving. Okay, so what is Data Science Continuum? I think this illustration that I actually just picked from Towards Data Science website gives you an idea, at least that I can relate with in the perspective of statistician on within the data science of different skills and roles that you can acquire. And yesterday you might have heard from some speakers who take different roles in this along this spectrum. For me, good thing about being in the academia is that I have gotten a chance to collaborate and work on projects that falls on different points along this continuum. So what I was thinking next is that I will I chose few of these projects that I will go over very briefly without getting into too much technical details, but hopefully that'll give you some idea about projects that you can work on. And obviously, if you are interested in learning more of these projects, please get in touch with me and I'm happy to chat. Okay, so with that, the first project that I chose is this we completed some time back, and that I also think that it falls on more towards the left corner of the continuum, right? So what we're going to do here, what we did here was to actually do a path clustering using polynomial regressions, okay? And let's see what's the background is. So to give an idea about the background, excuse me. So in meteorology, they utilize numerical models to do forecasting of cyclones, right? So one can think of it as, let's say at any given time point, let's take an initial time point, let's say time t0, you observe the storm and its environment. So basically you're observing the atmospheric characteristics, right? Something like that you see in this picture, you observe the atmosphere, and then those characteristics will be fed into numerical models that will predict the evolution of the atmosphere over time. Then from these forecasts, you can actually extract the physical evolution of the storm. But what happens when tropical cyclones become extratropical cyclones? There are a lot of complex interactions that happen in the atmosphere that it becomes very hard to forecast them. So scientists use this system called ensemble forecast to account for the uncertainty that happens because of these complex interactions. And this process creates a large amount of data. And a valid question to ask is, how do we effectively summarize and capture the essence of this amount of data that are generated by these ensembles? So to give you a brief idea about what ensemble forecasts are, so let's say here at time t0, right, in an initial time condition, you observe the atmosphere, something like the picture that we saw before, and then you take that picture and load it into numerical models to get the evolution over time for the storm, right? Excuse me. And then what the ensemble forecast does is that they take that initial condition that you observed, and to account for the uncertainty, they shake the system a little bit, right? So they add a little bit of an error and create a perturbed initial condition. So a perturbation of the initial condition, and then you feed that perturbation into the numerical models and get another forecast. And then you do it multiple times. So this is what ensemble forecast does, right? And in this system that we used have 50 perturbations. So they have 50 ensembles. Here's a quick example, right? So this is one of the storms, one of the cyclones that happened in 2008, which affected, the name of the cyclone is called Sinlaku. And this affected the areas like Taiwan, China, Japan, that part of the world. So in this picture, what you have is, in black, you have the actual track of the cyclone Sinlaku. And obviously, when they did the prediction, they did not know, like, for example, the data that you have here is September 9, 2008. So when they did the prediction, they had no idea about the actual track. And if you take this as the initial condition, the red line here is the reference line, and all the gray lines are the ensemble forecast. So basically, at this starting point, you have these 51 possible forecasting paths for this cyclone, right? Now, imagine you're the person who is explaining this to someone. You have many potential paths, right? So a question that we ask here is that, can we reduce the number of options in a represented way? In other words, how many unique paths are there? Can we group all these into few options? And how do we decide how many groups we have? And likewise, right? So in order to do that, we used polynomial regression. And you can use the regular cross-validation based model selection approaches to determine the order of the, excuse me, to determine the order of the polynomial as well as the number of clusters. Okay.
I found this on the web.
So this is the same stone, but a different starting point. Just because these are the three matching pictures that I could find in my easily. So I figured that I will use a different starting point. So it's the same track, same Sinlaku track, but in a different date. The previous one was September 9th or something. So here you still have the same thing. You have the reference line in red, and then you have the gray ones are the ensemble forecast. And then what we did was, as I said, we used polynomial regression based to cluster these paths. And then we end up using order 3 polynomial with 5 clusters based on model selections that we did based on cross-validation. And the results that you see here, if I can find my mouse pointer. Okay, where is it? Okay. You can see here are the mean tracks of the 5 clusters, and these are just the cluster memberships. And the good news was that when you do the clustering at each of these initial points, we were able to, at least one of our mean tracks when aligned very closely with the actual track, as you can see here, in every case. So that means that we were able to actually summarize the 50 tracks into 5 options, which aligned with the truth as well. So that was one project that I wanted to talk about. And another project with a little bit of a different flavor is that in this project, this is a little bit of a developmental type of a project, whereas the previous one was more like an application type of a project. So here, what we wanted to do was to do a block clustering, right? So I am saying some terminology that I will explain. So basically, as the title says, we're trying to do a block clustering with mixtures. And what's the idea here? So I'm assuming that people know what clustering is. Clustering means that grouping objects. And in a regular clustering exercise, what you do is you will be, if you look at a data set or an Excel sheet, you're basically shuffling the rows or creating permutations of the rows until the ones that look similar group together, right? So that's a regular clustering exercise. And in block clustering, what you're doing is you're shuffling the rows as well as the columns together, right? So for example, if you think of this matrix in the left-hand side, think of this as an Excel sheet where you have a bunch of columns and then a bunch of rows. And the intensity of the color is the value of the Excel sheet cell, right? And what we want to do is we want to rearrange the rows as well as the columns to get a pattern like in the right-hand side of the matrix, which is basically, so we want to rearrange the rows as well as the columns to get like checkerboard kind of pattern in the data. And this has been done previously. This is something very useful. There's a lot of literature in literature. There's a lot of examples of such exercises. And what's the new part here? So usually, if you think of the regular clustering, regular grouping, there are heuristic methods that you can use. There are model-based methods that you can use. And then it has been proven, it has been shown that if you actually use mixture models to do clustering, then you have a little bit of high power. So we wanted to use a mixture-based model to do the block clustering in this sense, with the same analogy. And if you think about examples in practice where this could be useful, I have listed two here, and I'll just explain one. Let's think about getting some biopsies from some normal patients and cancer patients, right? And then basically a column here is simply the gene expression profile for maybe a cancer patient. And then your next column can be the gene expression profile for a normal patient, right? You just don't know whether it's a normal patient or a cancer patient. You just don't know the labels. So you just have the gene expression profile. And the rows are a bunch of genes. What you want to do is to group the genes, as well as you want to bring the normal patients in your column, the columns belonging to normal patients together, and the columns belonging to cancer patients together, right? So this is what you want to do. And if you do an exercise like this, the advantage is that you can actually make conclusions or claims like, for example, you can say, okay, in the normal patients, this set of genes seems to be upregulated, and in cancer patients, this set of genes seems to be downregulated, comments like that. So that's one example, but there are other examples in literature where block clustering has been used to actually study the consumption patterns, understanding political opinions, and things like that. Okay. So this slide and the next two slides are the only slides that I have equations, but the only reason that I have equations is because I can't explain the project without the equation itself. So let me try and get through the, try and explain the equation here. So you have a data matrix here, right? And what we have is you have capital C number of columns and capital R number of rows. And each data cell, you will have a value like 25, 35, whatever the value, and you represent that value by this Xij. So Xij is the value in each cell. And in block clustering, what we want to do is to group the columns to say K2 groups and groups the rows into K1 groups. So for example, in the previous example, we had 2 groups in the rows and 3 groups in the columns, right? So we want to group them into K2 groups and let's say rows into K1 groups to be generalized. So once you do that, then each row will have a row label and each column will have a column cluster label. So with this setup, and if you assume that once the row label and the column label are given, your data are conditionally independent, you can write down the joint density of your data set, right? So if you fix the row label and the column label, you can treat them through, you can treat the data to be independent, and then you can in this way write down the joint density of the data set. But because we don't know the row label and the column label, you have to take into account of all possible combinations, right? You don't know whether the first row belongs to cluster 1 or 2 or K1. So you have to take into account the all possible combinations, and this becomes the full likelihood. So now once you actually have a likelihood, you can use algorithms like EM, MM to actually optimize this likelihood and find the parameters and find the labels technically. But in this case, it turns out because you have to account for all of these possible combinations, right? By that, I mean, if you take the row 1 can belong to group 1 or group 2 or group 3. You just don't know yet. So because of that, because we are considering these all possible combinations, to calculate this likelihood once, you have to do a huge number of computations. And that just means that the amount of computations also increase with the dimension of your data set exponentially. So because of that, optimizing this likelihood it becomes challenging. Basically, your EM algorithm and your likelihood becomes intractable, and you can't use this likelihood to estimate parameters and estimate labels. So what we have to do is, because of that, we have to find a different objective function that represents this full likelihood, but makes it easier to compute, right? And in order to do that, we borrow some ideas from a theory called composite likelihood. The idea of the composite likelihood is like this. So if you have a likelihood problem, and in this likelihood problem, if you can find a set of conditional or marginal events, by multiplying the likelihoods of these conditional and marginal events, you can find a likelihood which refers to as composite likelihood. And this composite likelihood, the estimates that are obtained by maximizing the composite likelihood has very nice properties like consistency of estimates, asymptotic normality, and things like that. So the challenge in our case was, how do we find, so we wanted to find an alternative objective function in place of that blue equation that we saw, right? And how do we find those marginal or conditional events that represents the full likelihood? That's the challenge. So here, what we did was, we started by looking at the rows. Now, if I write down the marginal density of this row, then we have this form, and then you can treat each row as a marginal event. So that means by multiplying the densities of the marginal densities of the rows, I can get a composite likelihood. We call that row composite likelihood. The issue is that only takes into account of the structure of the rows. Then what we did was basically do the same thing for the columns, right? So you can treat each column as a marginal event, and then you can multiply the marginal densities of those columns and get a column composite likelihood. But because we wanted a likelihood that represents the blue one, which takes the column as well as the row group structure, what we did here was, our proposal was to actually multiply these two and create something we call a complete composite likelihood. So this one here will take the account of the group structures, the row structures, as well as the column group structures. And what's the advantage here? The advantage is that, remember, in the previous case, if you just look at this equation, you have to compute so many terms just because of the fact that you are taking into account of all possible combinations. And because of these summation signs, because you have to aggregate over all possible combinations, you are doing large number of computations for each time that you want to evaluate the likelihood. But now if you go here, you are reducing the number of computations that you have to do hugely. So in the previous case, your computations increased exponentially with the number of rows and the number of columns in the data matrix, but here they just multiply R times C. So it reduces the computations very hugely, and it makes it using like algorithms like EM or MM very straightforward, because your likelihood is now tractable. And then the estimates that you actually get by maximizing this objective function, they have those nice properties like consistency or asymptotic normality and things like that. Okay, so that was the second project that I wanted to talk about. And so both the projects that I just briefly talked about, I mean, I did not get into technical details at all, except for in the second project, I had to explain because of the nature of the project. So those are two types of different projects that falls into the left side of this continuum. And the two other projects that I chose that I wanted to talk very briefly falls more towards the right side of this project, this continuum. So in this third project, what we're trying to do is to actually build a tool that create a system that automates the design and implementation of individualized ways in education. What do I mean by that? What we wanted, so what the idea is that we wanted to create a platform, and in this platform we call it as we have labeled it as iPractice, and this work is still ongoing. It's currently under review. The papers are currently under review, but the work is still ongoing. So we call this platform iPractice, and the purpose of this platform is to take the standing of a student, current standing of a student at any given point, and help them through a class using individualized resources, right? And what do I mean by that? Before I explain what I mean by that is, so this sketch or illustration that I have here, it actually explains or summarizes the process of iPractice. And I think if you think of sort of like a cruise control system of a car, that's the easiest way to think about it, because we are using control theory to actually design this system here. So think about a cruise control system, right? So what you do is you're basically setting the speed of a car. And once you set the speed, you as the driver decide, okay, this is the speed I want the car to go. And then the electrical and the mechanical system in your car will communicate continuously to maintain that speed, right? So you have a desired speed that we want your car to go, and then the electrical and the mechanical system will continuously communicate to each other to make sure that your car maintains that speed. So that's how you can also think of like a thermostat in a house. So you set the temperature in a thermostat, and then the broiler will continuously work to make sure that your house is the temperature of your house is set to the level that you want, right? So these are all control theory problems, and what we are doing here is to view education as a control theory problem. And what do I mean by that? So I think the easiest way to understand this is to think about a class where you say that you have a class and you want to set prerequisites, right? So basically what I mean by that is that, let's say that before the students coming into a class, you want them to have a certain level of algebra. You want them to have a knowledge on certain level of, let's say, multivariable calculus, and then you want them to know some level of R. But obviously, because students are coming from diverse backgrounds and they have different understanding, different depth of understanding of the material, although you want all of them to be here, they're in different places when they're coming into the class. So what you can use iPractice is that you can give them an assessment, and this assessment will evaluate where each student are, right? So for example, let's say that we have two students, student A and student B, and the student A, both of them are taking the same assessment, and the student A, suppose that, let's say that they do well in algebra and calculus component, but not so much in the R component, whereas the student B does well in the R component, but not so much in the algebra and the calculus component. So what iPractice does is now it will create individual pathways. So the standard is that both of them should know all three. One is missing R and the other one is missing the mathematical background. So based on the results of their assessment, iPractice will actually give them resources so that they can reach the level, the standing that you have set, through continuous assessment and providing resources to actually achieve there. So that's the personalized version of the, so this is similar to a control theory problem, and that's the personalized version of the education. Okay. All right. So as I said, so this falls into more towards the right side of the spectrum, right? And the last project that I wanted to briefly talk about is also, this project is very new. And if you ask me what model are we going to use here, my answer is going to be, I don't know yet, because we are still working on the project. It's currently ongoing. And here, what we're trying to do is to build a tool that will help clinicians or say nutritionists to determine the energy deficiency risk of female athletes. So to give a background, a little bit of a background, what happens is that when female athletes during their pre-season or in season, when they go through this hardcore training, like they train about sometimes like 20 hours a day. So when you go through this hardcore training, these athletes have high prevalence to observe disturbances in their menstrual cycles, which actually then lead to different medical problems. So it's so these disturbances in the menstrual cycle is usually caused by energy deficiency. And by energy deficiency, what you mean is that you have your energy expenditure, the energy that you spend is much larger than your energy intake. So there are existing ways to actually determine the energy deficiency, but however, many of these are time consuming and also can be expensive. So what we want to build in this project is a tool that ultimately help clinicians or nutritionists to make real-time decisions, right? So the idea is that if someone, a female athlete walks into your office, you have a simple, valid tool that you can quickly use to determine the energy deficiency risk of that person so that you can actually make interventions immediately. So the data that we use for this project, it actually comes from 3 different existing studies, which uses the same set of female athletes, and they uses different tools, however. So for example, one of the tools that they use measures body dissatisfaction. And by body dissatisfaction, what you means it's trying to measure how you feel about how you look. So there are few of these tools, standardized tools, that are existing tools that people use. So this study combined all these tools. So if you want to view that, you can think of this as a situation where we have a limited number of female athletes who are participated in these studies, but we have large number of features that we need to consider across 3 studies. And what we want to do is to figure out which of these features are very predictive of the level of energy deficiency for these female athletes, so that if a new athlete comes into this clinician's or nutrition's office, they can use these most predictive features and measure them immediately and figure out the risk of energy deficiency for these new athletes. So as I said, this is very, very new. This is something we are still working on. There are 2 graduate students who are working on this project. And but so I don't have any results or any models that I can share on the project, but that's the idea of the project, that this is currently ongoing. Okay, so that actually is, those are the 4 projects that I chose to talk about. And as I said, the first 2 projects, they fall on the left-hand side of the continuum. For example, let's see whether I can go back to. Yeah, so the first two projects that I discussed was in the left side of the continuum, whereas the last two projects that we talked about was in the right side of the continuum. And the results of these projects, none of these I can't take credit for any of these projects solely, right? I was collaborating with them, but there are a lot of people who were involved in these projects, and some of these people are listed here, but these include faculty, these include past and current graduate students, and many other people. So I mean, that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about, but so my idea is that, at least my hope is that by listening to these different projects, you get an idea of various types of projects that you can involve with. And then also you get an idea that different types of projects that falls onto the under the data science umbrella, and also inspires you somewhat to actually work on different projects and get in touch with different people. That is pretty much what I wanted to talk about. I was in the impression that I have half an hour, and I'm hoping that I did not run out of time, or I think maybe I have a little more time. So I'm happy to answer any of the questions that if you have any.
Yeah, thank you for enlightening us with that very informative speech, Dr. Prabhani.